My first guest this hour, it's Antony Loewenstein, an independent journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory. He joins me now live from Sydney. So I want to start by asking you, this UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, and yet Israel continues its attacks on Gaza. So is this resolution just sort of something symbolic, a piece of paper with words on it, or do you think it'll actually make any kind of difference on the ground?
The short answer is that these resolutions should be binding, and many international law experts today said that the idea that there was even a debate about that was a bizarre thought. The question, of course, is if Israel continues in Gaza, which it, by the way, is doing as we speak, what will the UN do? What will the US do? And I note today also, Francesca Albanese, one of the UN rapporteurs on Palestine, said that in a separate report about what's happening in Gaza for the last 6 or so months, that there needs to be something like an arms embargo on Israel imposed by much of the international community. Without something like that, even if there is a cessation of violence, which of course we all hope there will be, it's not necessarily permanent, and ultimately it's up to the UN Secretary General and frankly the UN as a whole body to take potential serious action against Israel if it continues to do so, because we are well past simply words being enough.
We heard the Palestinian ambassador to the UN calling for Chapter 7 to be used. I mean, can you explain that? Would that be something that could be used in this case if Israel doesn't comply?
I mean, essentially what he's talking about there, and amongst other leaders in the world as well, about something like sanctions. It's actually punitive sanctions. And I note that Colombia today, after this UN resolution, came out and said that if Israel ignores it, that it's the duty of all states to essentially cut off ties with Israel, which of course has mostly not happened since October 7. Many nations have been outraged and expressed their displeasure at the UN and elsewhere, but very few countries have actually formally cut ties. And this is really the next logical step. I mean, it's important to note that in the last 24 hours, although Israel has said that they will not send a delegation to Washington, the defense minister from Israel was in Washington, still speaking to the US, and one of his requests was more weapons. Now, you have to ask yourself, there's a bit of a disconnect here. If there's a permanent ceasefire, you don't need more weapons to continue your war. And from my understanding, that meeting was received quite well in Washington. So ultimately, unless the US imposes some kind of punitive sanctions now, or an arms embargo, and the US, of course, will not lead on that because they're the ones who are giving Israel the weapons, then we have a stalemate of sorts.
Now, if Israel doesn't comply with this resolution, it wouldn't really be the first time that Israel hasn't complied with previous UN Security Council resolutions. This time it's calling for a ceasefire during Ramadan, but you know as well as I do that Ramadan is over in 2 weeks. Are we back to square one then?
Potentially, yes. And of course, all this whole process, Israel has always said they would never actually agree to a permanent ceasefire. They say they want the hostages back, although I would argue that their military strategy is likely to bring those people home. But their view has always been, this is across the board, not just Netanyahu, but much of the Israeli government. We need to go into Rafah and we need to send huge amounts of troops into there. But it's also worth saying, as we're seeing in other parts of Gaza, Israel is facing what every occupation force faces, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Vietnam. You cannot hold territory unless you have literally millions of troops on the ground, which Israel is never going to have. So Hamas and other militant groups that keep popping up again after Israel had claimed to clear those areas. So ultimately, this is why Israel says we cannot agree to a permanent ceasefire. They are trying to win a war they will never win. And it's up to the international community to tell Israel to recognize that fact. And that needs to come from the UN Security Council, but particularly from the US.
Right. And the word here at the Security Council was a lasting ceasefire, not a permanent one. A word that was changed over the weekend. Antony Loewenstein, thank you so much for joining us here on the News Hour on TRT World.